This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. It's common knowledge that Vietnam and the United States have robust trade ties. The U.S. is Vietnam's top export market, and the latter's trade surplus with the former was $83 billion in 2023. America, of course, is not a monolith, and less discussed within this topic are the ties Vietnam has with individual states on the other side of the Pacific. Take Washington State as an example. It has a $3.5 billion two-way trade relationship with Vietnam. And many corporations based there are essentially household names here in Vietnam, and most countries, to be honest. I think Microsoft, Amazon, Starbucks, and Boeing, troubled as that last one may be. Vietnam, for its part, is the 10th largest export market for agricultural products from Washington State. In April, a government and business delegation from Washington conducted a 5-day trade mission to Vietnam, starting in Hanoi and finishing here in Ho Chi Minh City, meeting up with Vietnamese businesses and officials along the way. A key participant in that mission was today's guest, State Senator Joe Nguyen, whose district covers West Seattle and neighboring areas. Nguyen is chair of the State Senate's Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee, and one of the few Vietnamese Americans in state or national office in the U.S. We discussed his official visit and his takeaways on renewable energy and other issues he focuses on, his approach to this relationship given his Vietnamese background, investment opportunities for American companies, carbon markets, his hopes for the future of the relationship between Vietnam and his home state, and how Vietnamese officials view him, plus the amusing phrase media here picked up about him. As always, if you have any comments, feedback, or guest ideas, get in touch at matatarski@gmail.com. Let's get to my conversation with Senator Nguyen. Joe, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. John Harris, who put us in touch or suggested I should have you on, mentioned that you visited Vietnam recently, I guess in an official capacity for business delegation. So where did you go, and who did you meet while you were here?
Yeah, it was a really cool trip. So the state of Washington had a delegation that came, and it was with the governor's office and a few other folks as well. The governor was supposed to attend, but unfortunately he caught pneumonia right beforehand, so he couldn't make it. But it was one of those official state delegation meetings. Started off up north in Hanoi and met with some officials there, and then worked our way south to Ho Chi Minh City. And then we had kind of some branched off on some specific things as well. But Vietnam is one of our most important trade partners here in Washington State. And obviously, as you're seeing the geopolitical movements that are happening, where some people are going from China to Vietnam, it becomes an even more important trade partner. So we wanted to make sure that we're kind of on the forefront of that relationship. And then also, for us specifically, clean energy and climate change is a very critical component of our legislature and the work that we do, specifically that I do as well. And obviously Vietnam has been leading the way in Asia around some of those efforts for a variety of reasons. They wanted to see if there's any partnerships or potential there.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, and I've seen from looking at your bio, your focus on energy and the environment. Obviously, massive topics all over the world. Certainly, Vietnam is kind of, as I said, at the forefront of some of the clean energy stuff, but unfortunately also the forefront of climate change impacts. But I mean, what did you, I think John mentioned you met Celex Motors, which is, they make like electric motorbikes, I think for the logistics sector. But so what were some of your takeaways on those issues here?
Yeah, it was really cool. First off, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. What's interesting is the first few days, as one of the few Vietnamese legislators in the United States, it was kind of interesting to kind of feel out where they wanted to talk, how they want to engage in that kind of dynamic. We saw Celex, we saw the technology centers, and we saw a few other things as well. Candidly, I think the most interesting experience that I had was after the trip. So my family still lives there. I still have family in a village just south of Nha Trang in the little town. And it was driving from the airport from Nha Trang to the village. And I've done this before. First off, the highway is new, so it's like a brand new highway. And there's windmills all over the place on both sides of the highway. And I was talking to the cab driver and then my uncles when I got to the village and asked them about the wind turbines and said, hey, did anybody get mad? Was this contentious? Was it controversial at all? And they all looked at me like I was crazy and said, no, of course not. These are our wind turbines, right? Like we used to get rolling blackouts. Now we don't. And, even though even if they were designed in Germany, these are purchased and installed by Vietnamese people. These are our wind turbines. So even just seeing the way that Vietnam approaches clean energy is very different than you do here, because oftentimes you get into huge fights when it comes to installing some of those infrastructures. So seeing the people also be engaged in a way I thought was impressive. And then the other component too was you have a lot of these policies that Vietnam is implementing right now, whether it's DPPA or otherwise, or the energy strategy that you have. So Vietnam has very ambitious goals and very ambitious targets, similar to what we have in Washington State. And it even goes beyond clean energy. They want to be a G20 state by like 2030 or 2035, things like that, or G20 country, where you just saw a level of engagement that I think there's a passion behind pushing some of these initiatives, and you're transitioning to how do you actually do it. So it was interesting to be able to see leaders, local officials, everybody up and down the line agreeing that these are the goals, and now they have to figure out how to actually achieve them. I thought that was probably the most telling.
Yeah, I mean, the execution is, I suppose, the hardest part for everybody potentially, because I mean, the ambitions here, as you said, are certainly amazing, which I've talked about in a couple of previous episodes. I mean, you mentioned the DPPA, or direct purchase power agreement, which has previous listeners may have heard that discussed before. So I know they still have to figure out, I guess, how exactly it'll work and contract pricing and those sorts of things. But there's investors coming from Washington State or something like that. What are they hoping for with that?
A lot of folks are kind of paying attention now. So that just kicked in, a month and a half, 2 months ago, after some pretty intense negotiations for a while. And when you look at the supply chain and the infrastructure associated with it, a lot of the carbon emissions comes from the manufacturing source. So if you're a U.S.-based or Washington State-based company and you have supply chain in Vietnam, being able to decarbonize that is tremendous. The other hard part is just getting energy too, right? Like when you have a country where the infrastructure is not quite as modern as it could be, you're going to see a lot of distributed sources. So, I don't know who is making the investments just yet. I just know that some of the major companies here are taking a look at what that might entail for them, Amazon, Microsoft, maybe Costco, other folks, where they know they want to have a decarbonized supply chain to meet their Scope 3 emissions. This is one way to do it, and having kind of a framework to make it happen. And it's an interesting concept. I think, other folks may be able to learn from some of these things as well, but it is new. So we'll see how effective it actually is. But that's the key, is they get that, hey, we're not going to be able to get transmission lines up and down all around, especially with the terrain that they have. But if you can do direct power agreements, potentially you can just go straight to the source and plug it in.
And you mentioned Scope 3 emissions, just for listeners who may not be familiar with that. What does that mean?
Oh, yeah. Your Scope 3 emissions are basically things that are out of your control. Say, for instance, you're a company like Microsoft. Certainly, you have emissions that are associated with your business, but then there'll be things around, upstream supply chain issues, downstream supply chain. Probably a good example is Amazon, where if you were a person buying from Amazon, they can feasibly decarbonize their transit infrastructure. So your Scope 3 normally would just be, hey, I paid somebody to ship a product for me, Scope 3 emission potentially, right? But if you're Amazon and you can take care of that for everybody, you can basically decarbonize everything. So when you have costs associated with like the energy used to power your building, when you have carbon intensities when it comes to your manufacturing your goods, things that are kind of out of your control. But in this way, now you can bring that all in and say, our building, even though it was previously powered by gas, even if everything else was clean, the energy wasn't. Right now, you can make that actually clean as well.
And then in terms of, you mentioned, that Vietnam's a major trading partner of Washington State, and you also just mentioned, companies like Microsoft, Amazon, which I guess, even though I'm American, sometimes I kind of forget how many gigantic corporations are based in the state. So what are some of those trade ties between Vietnam and Washington State? I mean, like what sectors and things like that?
Yeah, agriculture is actually a pretty big one. So Washington State sends and gets a lot of supplies on the agricultural space from Vietnam. Boeing is a big partner, obviously, as well. I don't know how many times people brought up Microsoft and Amazon while we were there, right? So, people people pay attention to that. I think Vietnam is a unique culture in the sense that they've got this newer generation that's really latched on to technology. So it's a really core component of their economy as well. You know, oftentimes folks will have engineering teams that are in Vietnam just because the competency is there. The literacy rate is also very high. So everything from wheat to fruit to cherries to seafood, all the way to airplanes and technology and computers, things like that, kind of all over. And then we also have a number of manufacturers as well, whether it's furniture or otherwise. A lot of it comes from Vietnam.
And where do you kind of hope to see those ties go moving forward?
Yeah, well, first off, the Biden administration signed the agreement where we're having direct partnerships with Vietnam in a more robust way. So the Washington delegation was the first one to make it to Vietnam after that agreement was signed. So it was kind of a first draft or test drive in terms of what that could look like. I think the success of Washingtonians, the United States as a whole, is dependent upon the goods and services from Vietnam and vice versa. Like I said before, Vietnam is pretty clear they want to be a G20 country, and they see that their path towards doing that is through the United States, and then candidly, specifically through Vietnamese Americans that can help bridge that gap as well. And they know that the public sector is just as important as the private sector as it comes to creating policies to help make this work. So for us in Washington, it's going to be incredibly important because, when you see from a geopolitical perspective, goods and services shifting down to Vietnam and us being dependent upon that, that's a good relationship we want to have. But also, we have crops here, we have goods here that the Vietnamese people would like as well. One of the stops that we made, which sounds weird, but it was basically a grocery store. So they had us stop at this grocery store, and it wasn't quite Costco, but it wasn't quite just like a bodega. It was like a big grocery store, and they were so proud of it because it kind of represented the middle class growing, right? So you have these shops that you would have in the United States. So the fact that the middle class is growing so fast in Vietnam, I think there's a huge market for us, and vice versa.
And yeah, you mentioned the Vietnamese American aspect. I'm curious. Obviously, you said you have family here. I'm assuming you've visited. Have you visited a lot over the years? Okay, so quite a personal connection. What role does that play, kind of in your approach to ties with Vietnam, at least?
Yeah, it's a big deal. You've been there for a few years, so you kind of get how the dynamic works, right? Like titles are very important, relationships are very important, having that familial tie is very important. I know that there were a number of conversations where technically the governor and his office was supposed to be the lead. Now it's just kind of there as part of the delegation, even though my team was one that helped fund it. But the Vietnamese government was very clear that they were very excited to have the Vietnamese American legislator who was interested in bridging these gaps. And that's kind of why we've been in touch ever since then as well. And it plays such an important part. I don't know. I didn't think about how I was going to react to it just because, the history of the diaspora and the war is still very much alive and present here locally. Mm-hmm. In Seattle, but not necessarily in Vietnam. So I wasn't sure how I was going to be received here, but I also wasn't sure what folks were going to say once I came back. But overall, they're very positive. I think people understand that there's a history and there's a legacy there. But there's a kind of desire to move forward as well. For me personally, I think it just is kind of one of those dynamics where, better understanding where you came from and your family and the history of your culture, and meshing that with the work that I do now, the legislature, is a tremendous honor. And that's really why I wanted to go to Vietnam specifically and figure out ways for us to partner and help, because I think there's a lot that we can do to honor each other's past by really creating a better future for us as well.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of the focus on the future here. That's one of my, I'm not Vietnamese. I have no Vietnamese heritage or anything like that, but it's one of my favorite aspects here is that kind of optimism, I guess, a lot of the time, but kind of looking more towards the future. Whereas the U.S., there's definitely a lot I like about it, but there does seem to be kind of a dwelling on the past at times, which is the past is important, but sometimes it's a lot.
Yeah, because they're just trying to make it work, right? When your population, the average age is under 35, you have energy crisis, you have a shifting, the reason why they care so much about climate change is because they're one of the most heavily impacted by climate change. When you have such a long shore, literally just shoreline that is impacted by it. I remember going through to the Mekong Delta outside of Ho Chi Minh, and I saw an empty field, and I asked the driver what that was. He's like, well, those are rice paddies, but they haven't had a drought for the past couple of years, so they can't actually grow anything. The wind turbines that I mentioned earlier, they were also in what I thought were rice paddies or some sort of agrarian crop that were suffering from climate change. And this was a way for the farmers to actually produce on their land without having to actually grow anything. Mm-hmm. So it was cool to see kind of the intertwined nature, not cool in a good way, but so much as, climate change impacted them, and this is their pivot, and they're all in on doing it. And I think there's a lot that we're doing in Washington State to drive investments here locally that might work in Vietnam. One of the things that I saw and heard was, we have $1 trillion of investment. I'm making up that number. We have a lot of investments that we need to make. We want Americans or other companies to come in and help build this infrastructure. And then by doing so, now you have access to manufacturing and services and all these other things as well. So they see this as a symbiotic relationship. And I think that's one of the key points is I think that there are models, whether it's a carbon market or otherwise, that could be implemented where, people want to decarbonize here locally. They want to lower their emissions. But you can only buy so many credits in California or Quebec or Washington State, that if you open this up to be a global carbon market, you can feasibly get the resources to where the carbon emissions are happening and decarbonize your whole supply chain, and also get the, get the decarbonization benefits, get the resources necessary, and everybody wins.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of talk about carbon markets and carbon credits here as well, which again, there's also a lot of controversy around that issue globally. I mean, everyone's trying to figure it out. I think Vietnam wants to have their own domestic carbon market online, and by 2027 or 8 or something like that.
So as somebody who just did that for Washington State, so I was part of the implementation team that worked on what's called the Climate Commitment Act. There's a lot of pitfalls, and the pitfalls are political, they're policy, and generally speaking, any market, the bigger the better, right? You have more stability, the bigger the market is. So I think that's a viable path. The only concern that I have is if you don't do it correctly, you fail, and then now you're basically the third rail. You won't be able to do that anymore just because the outcomes weren't there, but mainly because it was implementation. It wasn't that it was bad policy.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how those go. And then I guess kind of so after you have one of these official trips, what is is there like continued dialogue with companies you visited or officials you visited? How do you kind of keep the momentum going?
Yeah, it's kind of choose your own adventure. So a lot of times these trips happen and nothing follows up. But I've been keeping in contact, obviously, John Harris and other folks as well. There's a number of companies, so Amazon being one of the bigger ones, I'm in touch with them to see kind of how they want to be able to interact as well. There's consultants on the ground in Vietnam that I've been in touch with to see how we can potentially partner up. I was invited back. I don't think I'll be able to make it because it's during New York Climate Week, but they're having an economic forum in Ho Chi Minh in September. Right, so I'm in touch with the government there to see when I can go back and help figure out solutions that they're working through as well. So I see this as a long-term play, regardless of the role that I have in our legislature. But I do think there's a ton of opportunity for us in Vietnam. I'm not quite sure exactly what it is, but it sounds like a lot of the same things that they're trying to tackle we've done in Washington State, and wondering if we can potentially share some knowledge that's there, and vice versa. Because I think, Asia is a big trading route, everything from, our supply chain and manufacturing to even like the maritime industry, where if we can help decarbonize trade from Asia to Washington State, that's a significant contribution to carbon emissions.
Sure.
So that's what it looks like. It just, the groundwork is set. We'll likely go back as a delegation, eventually as well. I'm trying to push to see if, say, for instance, the local Chamber of Commerce might be able to make it down there. But I think that there's an opportunity for us, because even during that trip, agnostic of the carbon emissions, you have some folks who are selling wheat and hay and cherries and even some other things that are now partnering in Vietnam, sending cargo containers over there. So we're already seeing the fruits of that labor, no pun intended. But also, I think that's the power of having these relationships is, okay, we had this trip, met these people, and now, there's these open channels of communication.
Just another question or two. I'm curious say Amazon decides that they want to invest $1 billion in data centers or something like that here, just as a hypothetical. Obviously, they don't need the state of Washington government's permission to do that. But, How much communication is there? I'm not saying Amazon specifically, but like when big Washington state companies decide to invest overseas, is there, coordination, communication? What's that process kind of like?
Yeah, sometimes, and they probably won't do data centers just because the data privacy laws in Vietnam
Yeah.
are not the most productive when it comes to business communities, but they might do something tangentially related. The answer is sometimes, right? So when Boeing does stuff with Vietnam, I'll tend to hear about it, and otherwise as well. But again, it's just based off footage. That's not something that you have to do. The agricultural community, oftentimes, if they have an issue, I'll hear about it. I did a tour of some farmlands in eastern Washington, and that was during kind of the dispute with wheat. So we kind of, connected the dots a little bit. So that just happens to be because folks know who I am and that I care about this space and that I've been kind of doing some work in this arena. I wouldn't say it's normal for, companies to do business outside of Washington State to then notify us. But because they know that this is such an important kind of trade partner and that I've worked in this space, I tend to get, included in some of these conversations.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I could see some people being like, oh, well, it's Vietnam. Let's check with, check with you or something like that.
Yeah, and it works, right? So, and that was the whole point of the trip was, I've gone there as a tourist and I've talked to folks. It's very different going there as an official state delegate. I've gone there a few times on family vacations, on funerals and things like that. And to go this time was very unique where the media was very aware that we were there. They had some pretty good coverage in the Hanoi Times, in the state TV, and things like that. And what was interesting to me was, I don't know how these things are staffed from their end, but they seemed to all have the same briefing memo about me because all the talking points were very similar. They kept calling me like, "Oh, you're Joe Nguyen, you're a senator. You went from zero to hero." The fourth person that said you went from zero to hero. I was like, "Why do you guys keep saying that?" And they pulled up an old article from the Hanoi Times from when I won 6 years ago, and that was basically the case was, family was in America, immigrants, poor. Now he's a senator. So the tagline was literally Senator Joe Nguyen, zero to hero. We all read it. So they kept calling me that, and I was like, "What are you talking about?" But yeah, I think that's cool.
That's funny. Yeah, I was like, "Why? I didn't ever consider myself a zero, but okay."
Yeah, I was like, "It seems pretty harsh, but okay, that's fine."
Okay. I mean, that's actually, I was going to ask if you kind of had one big, anecdote or takeaway. I mean, that's a pretty good one. But if you had any other, really anything really memorable from the trip.
I think a lot. So, and this is more on the personal side, but I think it felt like to me when I first got there, right? Because there's a couple of other Vietnamese legislators in the United States, even in Washington State, and their stance towards Vietnam is very different than mine, right? Theirs is very much, very frustrated with the history and the violence that had happened, and their current policies reflect that. So I think what was interesting is at the first meeting, folks were waiting to see how I'd react, and they saw that it was cordial, that I was welcoming, that I was trying to figure out how to build a better future, and everything just became nicer. Everybody just, like, the tensions just went down. And usually what would happen is you'd have the official state meeting. You have to sit in specific spots depending on how your stature is in that delegation. And usually your team on the advanced side would come in and they'd make sure all the seats are in the right spot. But in a couple of meetings, they wouldn't let them do that because they had me at the head of the table and not the governor's office. So it was,
okay.
I was like, I can't tell this is our purpose, but I see what you did and I'm not going to say anything.
Right.
And it was good to see that they put that level of, respect and credibility behind a lot of the work that's being done. So that's probably my biggest takeaway. And the other one too is that, you can tell Vietnam has made some big bets, some investments in technology, and they want to make it work. They're not quite there yet, but the idea that they're doing it and pushing it, is such an interesting paradigm from when I first was going visiting my family's rural village with a dirt floor to now they have these, technology centers that they want to fill out with people who are doing good things.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously a very dynamic place, exciting place to be. Well, Joe, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you're a busy guy, but I appreciate you coming on and sharing some insights and some experience. So thanks again for joining the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Hopefully, the next time I come back there, we'll meet in person because I think that will be another trip in the next year or so.
Yeah, that'd be great. Absolutely. That's it for this week's episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Connect with Vietnam Weekly on Threads, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform. That helps new people find it. See you next week.